It's the beginning of a process. France's Emmanuel Macron, as 6 more countries, including France, are expected to formally recognise a Palestinian state this Monday. A bid they hope to keep the long-term goal of peace and a two-state solution in play. The move comes as the war on Gaza continues, with some 2 million people currently trapped amid the bombings there. Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu has said that today's UN meeting and recognition of Palestine could now prompt him to go further in the West Bank, possibly annexing parts of it. But France and Saudi Arabia are pushing ahead with their plan, one which wants the establishment of a demilitarized state governed by the Palestinian Authority with international assistance. Their plan also calls for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, the return of all the hostages, and a complete Israeli withdrawal. The first step after recognition, a ceasefire, says the French president.
We have to preserve the condition of a political perspective for everybody. So we will announce a recognition, but which is the beginning of a political process and a peace and security plan for everybody. So right after this recognition, we have a first phase, which is, I would say, the emergency phase. Ceasefire, release of all hostages, and third, restoring the humanitarian roads and the stabilization of Gaza. We have a second package, which is the day after. We will revert on that, how to organize Gaza in terms of governance, security, and reconstruction. And third package, the perspective of the two states. But recognizing a Palestinian state today is the only way to provide a political solution to a situation which has to stop.
Well, the French president there, who along with 5 other countries expected to formally recognise a Palestinian state this Monday, talk of long-term peace on a day when hundreds of thousands of civilians, of children, are being forced from their homes, of being killed, shot, bombed or starved by Israeli forces. To get more insight on it all now, we're joined by former spokesman for the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, Mr. Chris Gunness. Thanks so much for your time and joining us here on France 24. Can I start by asking you just to give us your opinion on this recognition of a Palestinian state by more and more countries this Monday?
Well, in many states, of course, it is just symbolic. How can you talk of recognition when there's a genocide being committed against 2.3 million people in Gaza, and when we are on the verge, so we hear from far-right religious politicians in Israel, of an announcement of an annexation of the West Bank? But that said, I think one has to see this as a process, as Mr. Macron says. I think that if Israel reacts to this coordinated recognition package by announcing an annexation, then I think there has to be, and I think there will be, some kind of coordinated action in the United Nations to sanction Israel. And so I think that although for the moment it seems like a process, that process could either go in the direction of peace, as Mr. Macron clearly would like to see. There's no sign whatsoever that Israel is interested in that. Or it could go in the direction of the deepening isolation and pariah status of Israel, because if we're going to see an annexation, I think there's going to be a reaction, a coordinated reaction in the United Nations General Assembly. And at that point, it becomes Israel and America against the rest of the 193 members of the United Nations General Assembly.
But given that the United States stands so strongly beside Israel, despite everything we've seen over the last 2 years, despite, the UN Commission clearly saying that it is a genocide, we've seen international laws being broken. With the United States standing beside Israel, will the UN be able to take action? Will other countries finally step up and act?
Well, I think you have to understand that the American position is nuanced. And although Mr. Huckabee, the American ambassador to Israel, is a proponent of Greater Israel, there are others in the American administration who have a different view. For example, those who are pushing the idea of the Abraham Accords, the idea that Israel should sign diplomatic agreements, as it has done with some, with its Arab neighbors. Now, Saudi Arabia has made it clear that if Israel were to move ahead with the annexation of the West Bank, then the Abraham Accords recognition of Israel would be off the table. That's a red line. And there are those in the Trump administration who see a deal between the Saudis and the Israelis as the deal of the century. So it's not that simple. And of course, there are pressures within Israel. Mr. Netanyahu famously made his Sparta speech in which he said that Israel would prepare to become a micro nation that is given over to, as Sparta was, defending itself, huge armament industry. The main national priority would be security. And of course, there was an immediate reaction in Israeli stock markets. And I think many, at least some in Israel, look at that and say, no, we can't go down that road. So I think it's a very nuanced question. And I don't think you can take it as read that America will automatically stand by what is effectively the most far-right government in the history of Israel.
Okay, so it sounds like while it might be symbolic today, this could actually be a path towards peace, with Macron indeed saying the next step would be a ceasefire. But I mean, you've been a spokesperson, you've worked in Gaza for so many years. I mean, I imagine you still have a lot of contact with people in Gaza. What is the latest you're hearing on the ground there of what's happening?
The news there, of course, is the Israeli onslaught against Gaza City, which has been going on for several weeks now. Gaza, let us not forget, is home to over 1 million people. So things are desperate. The food distribution centres in Gaza, just 20 of some 50 of those centres are now open because Israel has told people to get out, and people are now so frightened that they are actually fleeing Gaza City, and B, because there is now a full military onslaught against Gaza. So the situation is already apocalyptic, and I fear it's going to get a lot worse if Israel carries through with this attack effectively to demolish Gaza City. And that's certainly what Bezalel Smotrich, the Israeli finance minister, has said publicly on the record yesterday. He talked about the commercialization, those weren't his views, this is my phrase. He talked about making a profit out of what is going on in Gaza. And if that is the case, instead of seeing what Mr. Macron envisages, which is steps towards peace, what we're seeing is the commercialization of genocide, the commercialization of ethnic cleansing, and the commercialization of apartheid. And that certainly isn't the direction in which those who are behind this recognition package would like to see things develop.
And Mr. Gunness, one would imagine that the ceasefire should come before all else. I mean, the immediate end to what we have been seeing, you know, so many scholars have called it what it is. Why do you think the world is so slow when it comes to reacting to Israel?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because I think at the level of the people, the argument is one. I think the world for the last 2 years has seen this live streamed genocide and is filled with revulsion. But at the level of government, the Israel lobby, the global Zionist lobby, has really exerted huge influence, not just on European governments, the Canadian government also, I think that is changing, but principally the American government. And until that changes, until there are punitive sanctions against Israel as envisaged by the International Court of Justice and the General Assembly, and let us not forget that last weekend, the deadline for Israel to end its illegal presence, the occupation, that passed. Both the ICJ and the General Assembly demanded that this should happen. And what must now kick in is a whole package of punitive sanctions. Turkey has led the way in imposing military and trade sanctions against Israel. And I think if we are going to see this continued onslaught against Gaza City, if we're to continue to see the establishment of the E1 settlement block, 30,000 new housing units in the West Bank, which would bifurcate the West Bank, cut off Jerusalem as the capital, Jerusalem and the holy sites for hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, then I think we are going to move towards punitive sanctions. And I think at that point, Israel begins to look like South Africa did in the 70s, where the apartheid system was embargoed. South Africa was effectively thrown out of the General Assembly, thus cementing its pariah status. And I think that is the move we're going to see. Israel's pariah status is going to be officially confirmed if we are going to see Israel reacting, as I fear many fear, which is to turn away from peace and not to grasp the opportunity that this recognition package affords.
Because Israel, throughout the past 2 years, again, it's constantly repeated its stance that it has the right to self-defense, and other countries have picked up on that rather than questioning the right to self-defense of all of the Palestinians. What do you make of that, and why isn't that being challenged?
International law is very clear. To put it at its most crude, you cannot commit genocide as a form of self-defense. And, you know, people had sympathy with this idea that Israel had the right to defend itself. But I think it very quickly became clear that the red lines, which the Biden administration, first of all, had outlined, that if Israel is going to defend itself, then it needs to do so in accordance with international law. And it soon became clear that that was not the case. And last week, we had the UN Commission of Inquiry officially saying that this is a genocide. They examined what was going on in Gaza according to the Genocide Convention, 4 categories of genocidal crimes, and they concluded that Israel not only is committing genocide, but that at the very top, the leadership of Israel has been inciting genocide. So I think the world has to come to its senses and realize that the Genocide Convention carries with it, and let's be clear, it's in the name, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. So there is now an obligation on all 195 member states of the United Nations that they have an obligation. It's not a matter of choice. There is an obligation to prevent and to punish genocide.
Mr. Chris Gunness, thanks so much for taking time out and speaking to us here on France 24. Very much appreciated.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.